Story 1. The Mile Marker That Counted Down. Marcus Townsend had been hauling freight across Interstate 80 for 17 years, and he prided himself on knowing every rest stop, every way station, and every quirk of the road between Sacramento and Reno. On October 14th, 2019, he was making his usual Wednesday night run, carrying a load of electronics destined for a warehouse in Sparks, Nevada. The weather was clear. His Kenworth T680 was running smooth, and his CB radio crackled with the familiar chatter of other drivers making the mountain crossing. Marcus had left Sacramento just after 8 p.m., timing his departure to miss the worst of the evening traffic. The climb into the Sierra Nevada was steady and uneventful, his headlights cutting through the darkness as he navigated the winding ascent. He'd made this run so many times that his hands moved on autopilot, downshifting for the grades, maintaining his speed, keeping a careful eye on his mirrors. The moon was barely a sliver that night, and beyond the reach of his headlights, the forest on either side of the highway was an impenetrable wall of black. Around 10:30, somewhere past Emigrant Gap, Marcus noticed something odd. He was approaching mile marker 164, one he'd passed hundreds of times before. But tonight, something about it caught his attention. Maybe it was the way his headlights hit it, or maybe it was just a trick of fatigue. But for a moment, he could have sworn the number looked different. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes with one hand, while keeping the other steady on the wheel, and looked again. Mile marker 164. Normal. He shook his head and kept driving. 3 minutes later, his headlights illuminated the next marker. Mile marker 163. Nothing unusual about that. The markers counted down as you headed west, though technically he was heading east. He'd stopped thinking about the logic of it years ago. But then, less than a minute later, another marker appeared. Mile marker 162. That wasn't right. The markers were spaced a mile apart. Even at his current speed of 65 miles per hour, he shouldn't be reaching them this quickly. Marcus checked his speedometer. 65. His odometer was clicking along normally. He glanced at his GPS unit mounted on the dash. The blue line showed him exactly where he should be, progressing along I-80 at a normal pace. Nothing seemed wrong with his instruments. He reached for his CB radio and clicked the transmitter. Any eastbound traffic past Emigrant Gap, this is Blue Thunder, come back. His call sign felt silly saying it out loud, but it had been his handle since his first year on the road. Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting the squelch, checking the channel. Nothing but that empty static hiss. That was unusual. There was almost always someone on the CB on this stretch, especially at night when the long-haul drivers owned the road. Another mile marker appeared in his headlights. Mile marker 161. Then, impossibly, marker 160 followed less than 30 seconds later. Marcus felt a cold sensation crawling up his spine. He pressed harder on the accelerator, watching his speed climb to 70, then 75. The markers kept coming, faster and faster. 159, 158, 157, each one appearing with increasing rapidity, as if the highway itself was contracting beneath his wheels. The forest on either side seemed to be pressing closer, the trees leaning in toward the road. His headlights should have been illuminating the reflective paint on the lane markers, but the white lines seemed dimmer now, harder to see. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles going white. He'd driven through fog, through blizzards, through situations that would have terrified a rookie driver. But this was different. This was wrong in a way that violated the basic rules of reality. Mile marker 150 flashed past, then 149, 148. They were coming every few seconds now, a countdown that made no sense. Marcus's heart was hammering in his chest. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool October air. His GPS was still showing him on I-80, still showing a normal rate of progress, but the evidence of his eyes told a different story. He thought about stopping, pulling over onto the shoulder, but something instinctive warned him against it. The darkness beyond his headlights felt hungry, waiting. He kept driving, kept his foot steady on the accelerator, even as the mile markers continued their impossible countdown. 140, 135, 130. The numbers were descending in jumps now, skipping markers entirely. Then, without warning, his headlights caught something that made him slam on his brakes. The trailer behind him shuddered and swayed as the air brakes engaged with a hiss. Standing directly in his lane, perhaps 50 feet ahead, was a figure. But calling it a figure felt inadequate. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head and shoulders extending above the reach of his high beams. It didn't move. It simply stood there, a darker shadow against the darkness, and Marcus had the terrible impression that it was waiting for him. His truck came to a complete stop, the engine idling, the dashboard lights casting a green glow across his face. Marcus couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at him to reverse, to turn around, to do anything but continue forward. But behind him stretched an empty highway, and he couldn't shake the feeling that going backward would be worse. The figure ahead remained motionless. Marcus's hand trembled as he reached for his phone. No signal. Of course. He was in the mountains, and coverage was spotty at the best of times. But he'd had a signal earlier. He always had at least one bar on this stretch. He looked at his GPS again. The screen flickered, and for just a moment, the blue line showing his position disappeared entirely, replaced by a blank gray screen. Then it returned, showing him still on I-80. But now the map looked subtly wrong. The curves of the highway didn't quite match his memory. The figure in the road moved. It didn't walk or step. It simply shifted position, suddenly 10 feet closer than it had been, as if the space between them had folded. Marcus made a sound in his throat, something between a gasp and a whimper. He shoved the gear shift into reverse, and the truck began backing up, the reverse alarm beeping steadily. He didn't care about the trailer, didn't care about the load, didn't care about anything except getting away from whatever that thing was. As he reversed, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirrors, he saw the mile markers going backward. 125, 126, 127. They were counting back up, the numbers increasing as he retreated. The figure was growing smaller in his windshield, but it was following, matching his speed exactly, always maintaining the same impossible distance. Marcus reversed for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Then his rear tires hit something, a bump or a dip in the road, and the jolt made him stop. His breathing was ragged, his shirt soaked with sweat. He looked forward again. The figure was gone. The road ahead was empty, illuminated by his headlights, looking exactly as it should. Ordinary asphalt, ordinary lane markers, ordinary darkness beyond. He checked his mirrors. Behind him, the highway stretched empty. He looked at the last mile marker he could see. Mile marker 164. The same one he'd passed when this all started. His GPS showed his position as exactly where it should be, a few miles past Emigrant Gap, heading east toward Nevada. His CB radio crackled to life, with a driver discussing road conditions near Truckee. Everything was normal. Marcus sat there for 5 full minutes, engine idling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had he fallen asleep? Was he having some kind of episode? But his load was still secure, his truck was undamaged, and every instrument showed normal function. Finally, hands still shaking, he put the transmission back into drive and continued forward. The mile markers counted down at their proper pace. 1 per mile. Normal, sane. He completed his delivery in Sparks without incident, but Marcus never took a night run on that stretch of I-80 again. He still drives, still hauls freight across the country. But now he plans his routes to cross the Sierra Nevada during daylight hours. He's never told anyone the full story of that night, fearing they'd think he'd cracked under the stress or fallen asleep at the wheel. But sometimes when he passes mile marker 164 during the day, he presses a little harder on the accelerator, and he doesn't slow down until those mountains are far behind him. Story 2. The truck stop that shouldn't exist. Denise Patterson had been driving a refrigerated trailer for Midwest Transport for 9 years when she encountered the truck stop that changed everything. It was February 2021, and she was hauling a load of frozen goods from Des Moines to Memphis, taking Highway 61 south through Missouri. The weather had been brutal all week, with ice storms and bitter cold, making every mile a challenge. By the time she crossed into Missouri, it was nearly 11 p.m., and Denise was exhausted. She'd been watching her fuel gauge with growing concern for the past hour. She'd planned to refuel in Hannibal, but road closures from a jackknifed semi had forced her to take a detour, adding miles she hadn't accounted for. Her GPS was showing the next truck stop as 30 miles ahead, and she wasn't sure she had enough diesel to make it. The temperature outside was 12 degrees, and she couldn't risk running out of fuel on a night like this. That's when she saw it. A green sign, illuminated by her headlights, indicating a truck stop at the next exit. Mel's Travel Plaza. Denise didn't recognize the name, but that wasn't unusual. New truck stops opened regularly, and she didn't run this route often enough to know every facility. The sign looked professional, properly reflective, with the standard symbols for fuel, food, and parking. She signaled and took the exit. The off-ramp curved to the right, descending into a shallow valley that Denise didn't remember from previous trips. The pavement was in perfect condition, freshly paved, with crisp white lines that seemed too bright. At the bottom of the ramp, she turned right as indicated by another sign, and after about a quarter mile, the truck stop came into view. Mel's Travel Plaza was enormous. The main building was a sprawling structure with large windows that glowed with warm yellow light. The parking lot was vast, with dozens of spaces, though only a handful of other trucks were visible. The fuel island had 8 pumps, all modern and well lit. Everything about it looked new, pristine even. Maybe this was one of those luxury truck stops that had been opening in recent years, catering to drivers with premium amenities. Denise pulled up to the diesel pumps and shut down her engine. The sudden silence was profound. No wind, no traffic noise from the highway, nothing. She realized she couldn't hear the highway at all, which was odd, considering she'd only traveled a quarter mile from the interstate. Shaking off the thought, she climbed down from her cab, the cold immediately biting through her jacket. The fuel pump was state-of-the-art, with a modern credit card reader and a full-color screen. But when she tried to insert her company fuel card, the reader beeped an error. She tried again. Same error. Frustrated and cold, she decided to go inside and prepay. As she walked toward the main building, she noticed something strange about the other trucks in the lot. They were old. Not just old, but ancient. She passed a Freightliner that looked like it was from the early 1980s. Then a Peterbilt that could have been from the 1970s. But they weren't restored classics. They looked like they were in active service, with current license plates and road grime. The door to the main building opened easily, and Denise stepped into a warm interior that smelled of coffee and diesel fuel. The space was designed like a classic truck stop, with a small restaurant area to the left, a convenience store section to the right, and a counter directly ahead. But everything felt slightly off. The fluorescent lights were too warm, casting an amber glow instead of the harsh white light she was used to. The products on the shelves looked familiar, but wrong, their packaging design seeming outdated. Behind the counter stood a man who appeared to be in his 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face. He smiled at her, a friendly expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Help you, miss?" he asked. His voice was pleasant enough, but there was something about his cadence that bothered Denise. It was too measured, too careful, as if he was thinking about each word before speaking it. "I need to prepay for diesel," Denise said, pulling out her personal credit card. "My fleet card isn't working at the pump." The man's smile widened slightly. "Sure thing. How much do you need?" "Fill it up. I've got a 100-gallon tank, and I'm down to a quarter." The man nodded and gestured to an old mechanical register on the counter. Not an old-style modern register, designed to look vintage, but an actual old register, the kind with buttons that clicked when you pressed them. "That'll be $87, he said. Denise froze. $87 for 75 gallons of diesel? "Diesel's $1.16 a gallon today," the man said, his smile never wavering. "Good price, considering the cold snap we're having." Denise felt her stomach drop. Diesel prices were over $3 a gallon. They had been for years. She looked at the man more carefully. His clothing was wrong too. His shirt was polyester, with a name tag that read Mel in faded letters, and his jeans were cut in a style she hadn't seen since she was a child. "What year is this?" she heard herself ask. The man's smile finally faltered. For just a moment, his expression went completely blank, as if someone had turned off a switch. Then the smile returned, but it was different now, stretched too wide, showing too many teeth. "It's February 15th, he said, 1984. Denise backed away from the counter. The other people in the truck stopped. 3 drivers sitting in the restaurant area, and a woman browsing the store shelves, had all stopped moving. They were frozen in place, like paused figures in a video. The man behind the counter tilted his head at an unnatural angle. "You need to fuel up," he said, and his voice had changed, becoming deeper, resonant, coming from somewhere that wasn't his mouth. "You can't leave without fueling up. Those are the rules." She turned and ran for the door. Behind her, she heard movement, the sound of multiple footsteps, not walking, but moving in perfectly synchronized rhythm. She hit the door at full speed, bursting out into the cold, and sprinted toward her truck. The other trucks in the lot were closer now, though she knew they hadn't moved. Their headlights clicked on in sequence, one after another, illuminating her path, but also boxing her in. Denise reached her Freightliner and hauled herself up into the cab, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the door handle. She turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Thank God for that, at least. She slammed the truck into gear and pulled away from the fuel island, not caring about the hoses still attached, not caring about anything except getting away. The hoses snapped free with a crack like gunshots. She drove toward the exit, toward the road that would take her back to the highway. But the road was different now. Instead of the quarter-mile drive back to the on-ramp, the road stretched ahead into darkness, going on and on, with no sign of the interstate. In her mirrors, she could see the truck stop receding, but it wasn't getting smaller. It was staying the same size, no matter how far she drove, as if she was on a treadmill. Denise made a decision. She cranked the wheel hard to the right, driving off the road entirely, bouncing across rough ground. Her refrigerated trailer swayed dangerously, and warning lights flashed on her dashboard, but she kept going. She crashed through brush and small trees, the branches scraping against her cab, with sounds like fingernails on metal. Her headlights illuminated a landscape that made no sense. Trees that were too uniform, ground that was too flat, a sky that was too dark. Then suddenly, she was back on pavement. Real pavement, with real highway markings and real road signs. Her GPS flickered back to life, showing her on Highway 61, exactly where she should be. In her rearview mirror, there was nothing but empty road and darkness. No truck stop, no exit, no sign for Mel's Travel Plaza. Denise drove for another 3 hours before she felt safe enough to stop, finally pulling into a familiar pilot travel center just south of the Missouri-Arkansas border. She filled up her tank with diesel that cost $3.18 per gallon, and the price had never seemed more reasonable. She went inside and bought the strongest coffee they had, her hands still trembling as she paid. She checked her watch. It was 2:30 a.m., which meant she'd lost about 3 hours somewhere. The drive from where she'd seen that exit to where she was now should have taken 90 minutes, but somehow it had taken much longer. Or maybe no time at all. She wasn't sure anymore. Denise completed her delivery to Memphis, but she filed a report with her company saying she needed to switch routes. She gave a vague excuse about finding the Missouri highways too stressful, and to her surprise, they accommodated her without question. She now runs exclusively in the western states, nowhere near Highway 61, nowhere near that stretch of Missouri where she saw the exit that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, late at night, she searches online for mentions of Mel's Travel Plaza. She's never found anything, but she has found stories from other drivers, scattered across forums and message boards, about truck stops that appear and disappear, about exits that lead nowhere, about places where the rules of time and space don't apply. She doesn't post her own story. She doesn't need to. She knows there are others who've seen what she's seen, and that knowledge is both comforting and terrifying, in equal measure. Story 3. The Hitchhiker Who Knew Too Much. Raymond Chen had a strict policy about hitchhikers. He never picked them up. In his 23 years of long-haul trucking, he'd seen too many situations go sideways, heard too many stories from other drivers about theft, violence, or just plain weirdness. So when he saw the man standing on the shoulder of Interstate 40 in the Arizona desert, on a scorching July afternoon in 2020, his first instinct was to keep driving. But something made him slow down. Maybe it was the heat, which was pushing 115 degrees according to his thermometer. Maybe it was the fact that the man was wearing a suit, of all things, completely inappropriate for the desert. Or maybe it was the way the man stood perfectly still, not waving his thumb or trying to flag Raymond down, just standing there with a small briefcase at his feet, watching the traffic pass. Raymond pulled over about 50 yards past the man, surprising himself even as he did it. He put on his hazard lights and watched in his side mirror as the man picked up his briefcase and walked toward the truck with measured, unhurried steps. Up close, through the mirror, Raymond could see the man more clearly. Middle-aged, perhaps 50, with dark hair graying at the temples. The suit was expensive-looking but outdated in style, something from the 1990s maybe. And despite the crushing heat, the man wasn't sweating. Raymond rolled down the passenger window. "Where are you headed?" he called out. "Flagstaff," the man replied. His voice was pleasant, cultured, with no particular accent. "I would appreciate the ride very much." Against every instinct that had kept Raymond safe for 2 decades, he unlocked the passenger door. The man climbed in with a grace that seemed practiced, settling into the seat and placing his briefcase carefully on his lap. The interior of the cab, which had been blisteringly hot even with the air conditioning running, suddenly felt cooler. Not in temperature, but in some other way Raymond couldn't quite define. "Name's Raymond," he said, pulling back onto the highway. "You can call me Thomas," the man replied. He was looking straight ahead through the windshield, his expression neutral. They drove in silence for several miles. Raymond kept sneaking glances at his passenger, trying to figure out what was bothering him. The man still wasn't sweating, despite having been standing in the desert. His suit, now that Raymond could see it in better light, wasn't just outdated. It was wrong. The cut was slightly off. The fabric moved strangely, and the color seemed to shift depending on the angle of the light. "You break down out there?" Raymond finally asked. "Something like that," Thomas replied. "Where's your car?" "I don't have a car." "So how'd you get out there in the middle of nowhere?" Thomas turned to look at him for the first time, and Raymond felt a chill despite the heat. The man's eyes were normal enough, brown and unremarkable, but the way he looked at Raymond felt intrusive, as if he was seeing more than just a face. "I walked," Thomas said simply. Raymond decided not to push it. Maybe the guy was running from something, or running to something. Either way, it wasn't Raymond's business. They were only about 70 miles from Flagstaff. He could endure an awkward silence for an hour. But Thomas spoke again. "You're thinking about your daughter," he said. Raymond's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Excuse me?" "Melissa. She's 24 now, lives in Portland. You haven't spoken to her in 3 years, ever since the argument about her boyfriend. You think about calling her every time you drive this route because you pass through Oregon twice a month, but you never do." The truck swerved slightly as Raymond's concentration broke. He corrected quickly, his heart pounding. "How do you know that?" he demanded. "How do you know my daughter's name?" Thomas didn't answer the question. "She thinks about you too, more than you realize. She wanted to call you on your birthday last month, but she wasn't sure you'd answer. You should call her. Tonight, when you stop in Flagstaff. Don't wait." "I asked you a question," Raymond said, his voice rising. "How the hell do you know about my daughter?" "I know a lot of things," Thomas replied calmly. "For instance, I know that in 16 miles, you're going to see a white sedan pulled over on the right shoulder. A woman with 2 children, her car overheated. You're going to drive past her because you'll think the highway patrol will help her. But they won't arrive for 45 minutes. And by then, the youngest child will be showing signs of heat exhaustion. If you stop, if you give them water and call for help, the child will be fine." Raymond felt like he couldn't breathe. The air conditioning was working, the vents were blowing cold air, but the interior of the cab felt suffocating. "What are you?" he asked quietly. "Just a passenger," Thomas said. He opened his briefcase, and Raymond couldn't help but glance over. The interior of the briefcase was wrong, impossibly deep, filled with what looked like papers or cards, thousands of them, more than could possibly fit in a case that size. Thomas pulled out a single card and looked at it. "Also, when you reach the Meteor Crater Road exit, about 40 miles from here, there's going to be a truck with a brown trailer 2 miles behind you. The driver is named Ken Holloway. He's driving on 4 hours of sleep over the past 2 days because his company is pushing him to make impossible deadlines. He's going to fall asleep at the wheel. If you're in the right lane when it happens, his truck will drift into your lane and you'll both go off the road. 43 people will attend your funeral, but not your daughter, because she'll think you wouldn't have wanted her there. If you move to the left lane and let him pass you, he'll drift off onto the shoulder instead, wake up, and pull over safely. You'll both live." "Stop it," Raymond said. His voice was shaking. "Just stop talking." "I'm trying to help you, Raymond. That's why I'm here. You picked me up, which means you get the information. That's how it works." They drove in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged with dread. Raymond's mind was reeling. Was this person insane? Was he some kind of con artist who'd researched Raymond ahead of time? But how? Raymond had decided to pull over on impulse. There was no way anyone could have known he'd be on this road at this time. 13 miles later, Raymond saw the white sedan. It was pulled over on the right shoulder, exactly as Thomas had described. A woman stood next to it, waving at passing traffic. 2 children were visible in the back seat. Raymond's foot hovered over the brake pedal. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was a coincidence, that Thomas had just made a lucky guess. But he could see the desperation in the woman's face as he approached. He pulled over. In the passenger seat, Thomas nodded once, a small gesture of approval. Raymond grabbed 2 bottles of water from his cooler and climbed down from the cab. The heat hit him like a physical force. The woman practically ran to him, thanking him frantically. Her youngest, a boy of about 6, was lethargic and flushed. Raymond called for help on his cell phone, while the boy drank water in the shade of Raymond's trailer. The highway patrol arrived 20 minutes later. When Raymond climbed back into his cab, Thomas was still there, still holding that card, still looking straight ahead. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly. "Who are you?" Raymond asked again. "Someone who knows what happens. Not what will happen, not what might happen. What does happen? Every moment, every choice, I see the outcomes. It's my burden. And you're telling me because you stopped. Most people don't. Most people drive right past hitchhikers like me. But you stopped, which means you're someone who still cares, even when you pretend not to. So I give you the information, and you can choose what to do with it. 23 miles later, Raymond saw the brown trailer approaching from behind, visible in his side mirror. The truck was moving erratically, drifting slightly. Raymond was in the right lane. He signaled, checked his blind spot, and moved left. The brown trailer passed him, and as it did, Raymond saw the driver's head nod forward. The truck drifted right, tires hitting the rumble strips on the shoulder. The driver jerked awake, corrected hard, and then pulled over safely. Raymond watched in his mirror as the truck stopped and the driver got out, walking in circles, slapping his own face, trying to wake himself up properly. "Thank you," Thomas said again. They reached Flagstaff an hour later. Raymond pulled into a truck stop, and before he could say anything, Thomas opened the door. "This is my stop," he said. "Wait," Raymond said. "I need to know. Are you human?" Thomas smiled for the first time, a sad expression that held something ancient. "I was once, a long time ago, but I saw something I shouldn't have seen, learned something I shouldn't have learned. Now I walk these roads, and I tell people what I know, and sometimes they listen. Call your daughter, Raymond. Don't wait. You have less time than you think." He climbed down from the cab and walked away, disappearing into the late afternoon crowd of truckers and travelers. Raymond sat there for a long time, engine idling, trying to process what had happened. Finally, he pulled out his phone and stared at it. Melissa's number was still in his contacts. He'd never deleted it, even during the worst of their estrangement. He called. She answered on the third ring. The conversation was awkward at first, then tearful, then healing. They talked for 2 hours. Raymond learned that he was going to be a grandfather, that Melissa was 4 months pregnant, that she'd been wanting to tell him, but was afraid he wouldn't care. He told her he cared more than anything, and he meant it. That was 4 years ago. Raymond is still driving, still running routes across the Southwest. He never saw Thomas again, never picked up another hitchhiker. But he calls his daughter every week now, and he's watched his grandson grow from a newborn to a toddler via video calls. He moved to Portland last year to be closer to them, taking local routes instead of long haul. Sometimes, when he's driving through Arizona on Interstate 40, he looks for a man in a suit standing on the shoulder. He doesn't know if he wants to see Thomas again, or if he's terrified of the possibility. But he knows one thing with absolute certainty. That afternoon, he met something that understood the fabric of reality in ways humans aren't meant to. And whatever Thomas was, whatever he is, he's still out there, walking the highways, waiting for the next driver who'll stop. Story 4. The Rest Stop with No Exit. Gerald Morrison had been driving professionally for 31 years, and he thought he knew every trick the road could play on a tired driver. He'd experienced microsleeps, hallucinations from exhaustion, and that dangerous twilight state where the miles pass without memory. But what happened to him on Interstate 95 in Georgia in November 2018 was something else entirely. It was 3 in the morning, and Gerald was hauling auto parts from Jacksonville to Charlotte. He'd been on the road for 9 hours, pushing the legal limit, and he needed a break. The next major rest stop was coming up in 5 miles, according to the signs. and Gerald planned to park for his mandatory 30-minute rest break before continuing. The rest stop appeared as promised, marked by the standard blue signs. Gerald took the exit, following the curve of the off-ramp into the facility. It was a typical Georgia rest area, a main building with restrooms and vending machines, a parking area for cars, and a separate section for commercial vehicles. Only a few other vehicles were present, which wasn't surprising given the hour. Gerald parked his rig in the truck section, set his parking brake, and filled out his logbook. The digital clock on his dash read 3:17 a.m. He'd rest until 3:47, then get back on the road. He had a cooler with sandwiches in the cab, so he didn't need to go inside. He reclined his seat, set an alarm on his phone, and closed his eyes. The alarm woke him at 3:47. Gerald sat up, feeling marginally refreshed. He started his engine, let it warm up for a minute, and then put the truck in gear. That's when he noticed something odd. The rest stop was busier now. Several more trucks had arrived, and the parking lot was nearly full. That wasn't strange in itself, except Gerald had the distinct impression that these were the same trucks that had been here when he arrived. He recognized a distinctive paint job on a Peterbilt 3 spaces over, and a refrigerated trailer with company logos that had been across from him. Gerald shrugged it off and drove toward the exit. The rest stop had a simple loop design. You entered from one side, parked, and exited from the other side, back onto the highway. But as Gerald followed the road toward the exit, something felt wrong. The loop seemed longer than it should be. He drove for what felt like a full minute, his headlights illuminating the curved road, following the painted lines. But the exit never appeared. Instead, he found himself back at the parking area. The same parking area he'd just left, with the same trucks in the same positions. Gerald stopped, confused. Had he gotten turned around somehow? He looked at his GPS, which showed him at the rest stop, a blue dot on a simple diagram. The exit should be obvious. He drove forward again, following the only road that led away from the parking area, moving slowly and carefully. 2 minutes later, he was back at the parking area. Same trucks, same positions. The Peterbilt with the distinctive paint job was still 3 spaces from where he'd been parked. Gerald felt a prickle of unease. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from his cab. Maybe there was construction, or a detour, or something he was missing. He walked toward the main building, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The building was lit from inside, fluorescent lights visible through the windows, but when he tried the door, it was locked. He peered through the glass. The interior looked normal. Tile floors, a hallway leading to restrooms, vending machines along one wall. But there was no movement, no people, no signs of life. Gerald walked back to his truck, passing other rigs. He knocked on the door of the nearest one, a blue Freightliner. No answer. He tried another truck. Nothing. The cabs all appeared occupied. He could see shapes in the sleeper berths, but no one responded to his knocking. His unease was growing into fear now. He climbed back into his truck and tried his CB radio. "This is Southern Freight. Anyone at the 95 rest stop, come back." Static. He tried his cell phone. No signal. His GPS was still working, still showing him at the rest stop. But when he tried to zoom out to see the surrounding highways, the screen flickered and returned to the same close-up view. Gerald decided to try again. He put his truck in gear and drove forward, this time paying careful attention to every detail. The road curved to the right, exactly as a rest stop exit should. He followed it, watching his odometer. He drove 1/10 of a mile, then 2/10, then 3. The road just kept curving, a gentle arc that never straightened, never reached the highway. And then, inevitably, he was back at the parking area. This time, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. His own truck was still parked in its original space. He could see it clearly, a red Kenworth with his company's logo, sitting exactly where he'd left it. But he was driving his truck. He looked down at the interior of his cab, at his hands on the steering wheel, at the familiar dashboard. This was his truck. But that was also his truck, parked over there. Gerald stopped in the middle of the road, his engine idling, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Slowly, not wanting to but unable to stop himself, he drove closer to the parked version of his truck. As he approached, he could see through the windshield. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat. Someone who looked exactly like him. The figure in the parked truck turned its head and looked directly at Gerald. It smiled, but the expression was wrong, too wide, too knowing. Then it waved, a slow, deliberate gesture. Gerald stomped on the accelerator, his truck lurching forward, and he drove away from the parking area as fast as he dared. He didn't care where the road led anymore. He just needed to get away from that thing that wore his face. The road stretched ahead, curving endlessly. Gerald's speedometer showed 40 miles per hour, then 50. His heart was hammering in his chest. In his mirrors, he could see the rest stop receding, the lights getting smaller. But the highway never appeared. The road just went on and on, a perfect curve through darkness. Then, suddenly, the curve straightened. Gerald saw the on-ramp ahead, saw the lights of I-95, saw other vehicles moving on the interstate. He merged onto the highway, his hands shaking so badly he could barely control the wheel. He checked his mirrors. The rest stop was behind him, looking perfectly normal, lit and peaceful. His GPS showed him on I-95, heading north, making normal progress. Gerald looked at his clock. It read 3:18 a.m. He grabbed his phone and checked the time. 3:18 a.m. But he'd been at that rest stop for at least 30 minutes, maybe longer. He checked his logbook. His last entry showed him arriving at the rest stop at 3:17. 1 minute. According to every record, every device, every instrument, he'd been at the rest stop for 1 minute. Gerald drove for the next 6 hours without stopping, completing his run to Charlotte on pure adrenaline and fear. He filed his paperwork and went home to his apartment, where he sat in silence for hours, trying to convince himself he'd fallen asleep, that it had been a vivid dream. But he knew it hadn't been. The memory was too clear, too sharp, too real. Over the next few weeks, Gerald tried to research the rest stop. He drove the route again during the day, looking for it. The blue signs directed him to a rest area at the same mile marker, but when he took the exit, he found himself at a completely different facility, one that was older and smaller than the rest stop he remembered. He asked other drivers if they'd experienced anything strange on that stretch of I-95. Most looked at him like he was crazy, but one older driver, a man named Frank who'd been driving longer than Gerald, pulled him aside. "You got caught in a loop," Frank said quietly. "Happens sometimes, certain places, certain times of night. Most drivers don't talk about it because they think people will say they were driving drowsy. But I've heard the stories. Rest stops that trap you, exits that circle back on themselves, roads that go nowhere. You got out, so count yourself lucky. Some drivers don't. Gerald never took that route again at night. He requested schedule changes, filed paperwork to avoid I-95 through Georgia entirely. His company accommodated him without question, probably thinking he was getting too old for long-haul work. Maybe he is. He's thinking about retirement now, about getting off the road permanently, because there are places out there, caught between one state and another, one moment and another, where the normal rules don't apply. Rest stops where time loops, where you can see yourself parked while you're driving, where you can spend an eternity in 30 seconds or 30 seconds in an eternity. Gerald found one of those places, and though he escaped, part of him wonders if he really did. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, he questions whether he's truly in his apartment in Charlotte, or if he's still at that rest stop, driving in an endless circle, and everything since has been a dream to keep him docile. He pushes those thoughts away when they come, but they always return, insistent and terrifying, like a road that curves forever without ever reaching its destination. Story 5. The Load That Whispered. Carmen Vasquez had been hauling specialized cargo for 12 years, and she prided herself on asking no questions. She transported what needed transporting, followed the instructions on her manifests, and collected her pay. In her line of work, curiosity wasn't a virtue, it was a liability. But the load she picked up from a warehouse outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, in August 2022, broke through every rule she'd set for herself. The job came through her regular broker, listed as medical equipment requiring temperature control and careful handling. The pay was excellent, nearly double her usual rate for a relatively short haul from Albuquerque to a research facility in Colorado Springs. Carmen arrived at the pickup location at 6 p.m. as instructed. The warehouse was unremarkable from the outside, a standard industrial building in a commercial district. But when she backed her refrigerated trailer up to the loading dock, she noticed that all the windows were painted over, and the security presence was unusually heavy for a medical supply warehouse. 4 men in identical gray uniforms loaded her trailer, working in complete silence. The cargo consisted of 12 wooden crates, each about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, marked only with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to Carmen. The crates were secured with heavy straps, and the men gave her strict instructions. Maintain the trailer temperature at exactly 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Do not open the trailer for any reason. Drive directly to the destination without unnecessary stops, and deliver between midnight and 2 a.m. Carmen signed the paperwork, locked the trailer, and set out. The route was straightforward. Interstate 25 north through New Mexico into Colorado, about 400 miles total. She planned to drive through the night, making only one stop for fuel and food around the halfway point. The evening was clear, and traffic was light. Everything was routine. Until she heard the first whisper. It came about an hour into the drive, somewhere north of Santa Fe. Carmen was listening to a podcast through her speakers, but underneath the voices of the hosts, she heard something else. A soft sound, almost below the threshold of hearing, like someone speaking very quietly, in a language she didn't understand. She turned down the podcast volume. The whispering continued, faint but persistent. At first, Carmen assumed it was radio interference, or a problem with her speakers. She turned off the audio system entirely. The whispering didn't stop. If anything, it became slightly more distinct, though still too quiet to make out individual words. It seemed to be coming from behind her, from the trailer. Carmen's immediate thought was that someone had stowed away in her trailer, though she couldn't imagine how they'd survived the cold temperature she was maintaining. She checked her trailer temperature monitor on the dashboard. 38 degrees, exactly as required. She reached for her CB radio, thinking she should call the broker, but something made her hesitate. The whispering had a quality that made her skin crawl, but it wasn't threatening. It sounded more like pleading. She drove on, trying to ignore it, but the whispering grew gradually louder. By the time she reached the town of Las Vegas, New Mexico, the sound was clear enough that she could almost distinguish words, though they were in no language she recognized. The cadence was wrong, the syllables too long or too short, sounds that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. Carmen pulled into a truck stop in Las Vegas, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She parked in a well-lit area and sat in her cab for several minutes, trying to calm her racing heart. The whispering continued, a constant murmur that seemed to seep through the walls of her cab. She could feel it now, not just hear it. The sound had a physical presence, like pressure against her eardrums. Against her better judgment, Carmen climbed down from her cab and walked back to her trailer. She placed her hand on the cold metal doors. The whispering immediately intensified, becoming almost frantic. She snatched her hand away. Through the metal, she could feel vibration, not from any mechanical source, but from something inside the trailer. Something that was responding to her touch. Carmen's instruction had been clear. Do not open the trailer. But the desperation in those whispers was overwhelming. Whatever was in those crates, it was aware. It was conscious. And it was begging for something, though Carmen didn't know what. She returned to her cab and grabbed her phone, intending to call the broker and demand answers. No signal. That wasn't unusual in this part of New Mexico, but the timing felt ominous. She started her truck and pulled back onto the highway, deciding to complete the delivery and never take a job from this broker again. The whispering changed as she drove north into Colorado. The tone shifted from pleading to something else, something that might have been anger or fear. The temperature gauge on her trailer started fluctuating, dropping to 36 degrees, then rising to 40, despite the refrigeration unit running at full capacity. Carmen adjusted the controls, but the temperature continued to swing. And the whispering grew louder still, now clearly audible over the sound of her engine. Words began to emerge from the chaos of sounds. At least, Carmen thought they were words. They still weren't in any language she knew, but they had structure, meaning. She found herself understanding fragments of intent, if not actual meaning. They wanted out. They wanted help. They were afraid of where they were going. Carmen's hands were shaking on the wheel. She considered pulling over, abandoning the load, just walking away and letting someone else deal with this nightmare. But she'd signed contracts, taken payment, and more than that, she felt a terrible responsibility. Whatever was in those crates, it was suffering. She could feel that suffering radiating through the connection between her truck and trailer, seeping into her bones. North of Pueblo, the whispering suddenly stopped. The silence was so abrupt and complete, that Carmen gasped aloud. She checked her trailer temperature. It had stabilized at exactly 38 degrees. Her relief lasted about 10 seconds before she heard a new sound. This wasn't whispering. This was banging. Something inside the trailer was hitting the walls, rhythmic impacts that made her whole truck shudder with each blow. Carmen sped up, pushing her truck to 75 miles per hour, desperate to reach the delivery point. The banging continued, growing more violent. In her side mirrors, she could see her trailer rocking with each impact, the whole assembly swaying more than it should given the cargo's weight. Other vehicles on the highway were giving her wide berth, probably assuming she had an unsecured load or a mechanical problem. She reached the Colorado Springs exit at 12:30 a.m. The delivery address was for a facility on the outskirts of the city, a compound surrounded by high fences and security gates. Carmen had never been so relieved to reach a destination. She pulled up to the gate, and a guard checked her paperwork before waving her through. The banging from her trailer had stopped, replaced again by that awful whispering. But now it sounded different, resigned, defeated. The facility was all concrete and harsh lighting. Personnel in white protective suits directed her to a loading dock. As she backed in, she saw that the dock led to what looked like an airlock, thick doors that sealed completely. The moment her trailer connected to the dock, people swarmed around it, disconnecting it from her cab with practiced efficiency. They moved her truck away before beginning the unloading process, and Carmen realized she wouldn't see what was in those crates. A man in a business suit met her in an office to complete the paperwork. He was professional, courteous, and utterly disinterested in making conversation. He handed her a payment confirmation and a non-disclosure agreement. The NDA was 20 pages long and threatened severe legal consequences for discussing the cargo or delivery. Carmen signed it without reading, just wanting to leave. As she drove away from the facility, heading back toward the interstate, the relief she'd expected didn't come. Instead, she felt hollow, guilty. Those whispers had been real. Whatever was in those crates was conscious and aware, and she'd delivered it to a place where it clearly didn't want to be. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that she didn't know what the cargo actually was, that it might have been some kind of elaborate hoax or security measure. But deep down, she knew better. Carmen drove home to New Mexico, and she never took another job involving that broker or that type of cargo. She searched online for any information about the facility in Colorado Springs, but found nothing unusual. It was listed as a private research laboratory, one of hundreds in the area. She looked for stories from other drivers about strange cargo or whispering loads, and found a few scattered reports, mostly dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations or fabrications. But Carmen knows what she heard. She knows that somewhere in that facility, in those 12 crates, something is trapped. Something that thinks, that feels, that was afraid. She doesn't know if it's human or was human, or is something else entirely. She tells herself there's nothing she can do, that she's just a truck driver who transported a load and got paid. But the guilt remains, and sometimes, late at night in the silence of her apartment, she hears the faintest echo of those whispers, and she knows they'll never completely leave her. Some cargo leaves marks on you that no amount of distance or time can erase. And Carmen carries those marks now, invisible scars from the night she transported something that should never have been crated, loaded, and delivered to a place where light dies, and questions are never answered. Story 6. The Fog That Followed. Daniel Pritchard had been driving a tanker truck for 18 years, hauling various liquids across the country with a perfect safety record. He was meticulous, careful, and prided himself on his professionalism. In October 2019, he was transporting a load of industrial chemicals from Baton Rouge to Atlanta, taking Interstate 20 east through Louisiana and into Mississippi. The weather forecast had called for clear conditions, but as Daniel crossed into Mississippi around 9 p.m., he encountered fog. It appeared suddenly, a wall of gray that his headlights could barely penetrate. He slowed to 45 miles per hour, turned on his fog lights, and increased his following distance behind the few vehicles he could see ahead. Fog wasn't unusual in this region in autumn, though this was particularly dense. What was unusual was that the fog seemed to move. Daniel noticed it after about 10 minutes of driving through the thick gray. The fog wasn't just sitting on the road like normal fog. It was flowing, moving in patterns that seemed purposeful, eddying and swirling around his truck in ways that didn't match the relatively calm night air. He could see clear air above, stars visible through gaps, but at road level, the fog was impenetrable. He drove slowly and carefully for another 20 miles, and then he noticed something that made him uneasy. He was alone on the highway, completely alone. The vehicles that had been ahead of him were gone. He hadn't seen them pull off, hadn't seen them speed away. They'd simply disappeared. And his CB radio, which had been crackling with the usual chatter of drivers, was silent. Daniel reached for his phone to check his GPS. The screen showed his position on I-20, moving east as expected, but the map looked strange. The highway was shown correctly, but all the surrounding details were missing. No towns, no exits, no landmarks. Just a thin line representing the interstate, cutting through blank space. The fog began to press closer to his truck. Daniel could see it clearly in his headlights and side mirrors, moving like something alive, reaching out with tendrils that extended and retracted. He told himself it was just the movement of his truck creating air currents, but the rational explanation felt hollow. The fog was behaving like a predator testing its prey, probing for weakness. Then he saw the shapes. They were indistinct at first, just darker patches within the fog, but as Daniel stared, they resolved into almost recognizable forms, human-like figures, but stretched and distorted, standing at the edge of the road. As he passed them, they turned to watch his truck, their movements too smooth, too fluid. Daniel counted 5, then 10, then more than he could track. They weren't walking or running. They were gliding through the fog, keeping pace with his truck. Daniel pressed harder on the accelerator, bringing his speed up to 50, then 55. The fog thickened in response, reducing his visibility to less than 20 feet. The figures multiplied, dozens of them now, forming a corridor along both sides of the highway. They were herding him, Daniel realized with growing terror, keeping him on the road, preventing him from pulling over or stopping. His fuel gauge caught his attention. It was dropping faster than it should. He'd filled his tanks in Baton Rouge less than 3 hours ago. He should have at least 3/4 of a tank remaining, but the gauge showed half. As he watched, the needle continued to drop, falling toward 1/4. His speed was steady, his engine was running normally, but something was consuming his fuel at an impossible rate. Daniel tried his CB radio again. "This is Eagle Transport. Anyone on I-20 in Mississippi, please respond." His voice sounded strange, flat and dead, as if the fog was absorbing the sound. The radio crackled, and for a moment he thought he heard a response. But it wasn't a human voice. It was a sound like wind through caves, like metal scraping stone, like voices speaking backward. He switched off the radio. The figures in the fog were closer now, sometimes only a few feet from his truck. Daniel could see them more clearly, and he wished he couldn't. They had roughly human shapes, but their proportions were wrong. Arms too long, heads too large, bodies that seemed to fold and bend in ways that defied anatomy. And where their faces should have been, there was only more fog, swirling and condensing, but never forming features. His fuel gauge hit 1/4 tank. At his current rate of consumption, he'd run out in less than an hour. Daniel made a decision. At the next clear stretch of road, he was going to crash through the fog and try to find an exit, any exit, even if it meant driving off the highway entirely. Staying on I-20 wasn't safe. This wasn't normal fog, and these weren't hallucinations. Something was very wrong with this stretch of highway, and he needed to escape it. An exit sign appeared in his headlights. Exit 137, with symbols indicating food and fuel. Daniel had driven this route dozens of times. He knew this section of I-20. There was no exit 137. Exits in this area jumped from 135 to 140, but the sign looked official, properly reflective, positioned exactly where an exit sign should be. The figures in the fog had pulled back slightly, creating a space around the off-ramp. Daniel didn't trust it. Every instinct screamed that taking that exit would be a mistake. He kept driving straight, ignoring the exit. In his mirrors, he saw the ramp receding, saw the fog surge back across where it had been, erasing it as if it had never existed. The figures pressed closer again, and the fog thickened until Daniel could barely see the hood of his truck. His fuel gauge dropped to empty. The low fuel warning light illuminated on his dashboard. Daniel felt a cold sweat break out across his body. He was going to run out of fuel in this nightmare fog, stranded with those things surrounding him. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, coaxing every bit of speed he could from his truck. 60 miles per hour, 65. The fog was trying to slow him. He could feel resistance, as if he was driving through water instead of air. Then, ahead, he saw lights. Real lights, the harsh sodium orange of highway lighting, cutting through the fog. And beyond them, clear air. Daniel aimed for those lights, like a drowning man swimming toward the surface. The fog fought him, thickening into something almost solid, and the figures surged forward, dozens of them, converging on his truck from both sides. Daniel's truck burst through the wall of fog and into clear air. The transition was so abrupt, it felt physical, like breaking through a membrane. Behind him, the fog stopped at a precise line, as if held back by an invisible barrier. The figures were at that barrier, standing motionless, watching him drive away. Daniel could see them clearly now in his mirrors, illuminated by his truck's lights. They weren't human. They'd never been human. They were something else, something that lived in that fog, or was part of that fog, or perhaps was the fog itself. His fuel gauge read 3/4 full. Daniel stared at it in disbelief. It had been at empty just seconds ago. He checked his clock. It was 9:40 p.m. Less than an hour had passed since he'd entered the fog, though it had felt much longer. His GPS showed him on I-20, exactly where he should be. with all the normal map details restored. His CB radio crackled with normal traffic. Daniel pulled over at the next rest area, his whole body shaking. Other trucks were parked there, their drivers sleeping or taking breaks, everything normal and ordinary. He climbed down from his cab and looked back the way he'd come. The fog was visible in the distance, a distinct bank of grey sitting on the highway, but it wasn't moving. It was just fog, behaving like fog should. The figures were gone. He stayed at that rest area for 2 hours, drinking coffee from his thermos, trying to process what had happened. Eventually, he continued his journey to Atlanta, but he drove slowly, carefully, watching for any sign of unusual fog. The rest of the trip was uneventful. Daniel completed his delivery and then requested a route change. He gave a vague explanation about preferring northern routes, and his company accommodated him. He hasn't driven through that section of Mississippi since that night. He's researched the area, looking for explanations, finding stories about anomalies, strange occurrences, disappearances. Interstate 20 through central Mississippi has a reputation among some drivers, though most dismiss the stories as urban legends. But Daniel knows better. He encountered something on that highway, something that hides in fog and hunts vehicles, that creates false exits and drains fuel and herds its prey along an endless road. He escaped because he refused to leave the highway when the fog wanted him to, because some instinct told him that the false exit would have led somewhere far worse than a foggy road. He sometimes wonders what would have happened if he'd taken that exit, where it would have led. But he never wonders for long. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some roads are better left untraveled. The fog is still out there, waiting for the next driver who will enter it, without knowing what hunts within its grey embrace. And Daniel carries the memory of those figures like a weight, a constant reminder that the highways we travel cross more than just geography. Sometimes they cross into territories where the familiar rules of reality break down, where fog can think and hunt, and where taking the wrong exit means never finding your way back to the world you know. Story 7. The Bridge That Changed. Helen Martinez had been a truck driver for 15 years, and she'd crossed thousands of bridges in that time. She'd navigated high mountain passes, driven across massive suspension bridges, and crossed ancient structures that swayed alarmingly under the weight of her loaded trailer. But the bridge on State Route 47 in Missouri, the bridge she'd crossed dozens of times without incident, was about to become the one that ended her career. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March 2021. Helen was hauling a load of building materials from Kansas City to St. Louis, taking back roads to avoid construction on the interstate. Route 47 was a quiet highway that ran through rural Missouri, passing through small towns and farmland. The bridge in Nabaum Question crossed the Missouri River at a narrow point, a relatively short span that Helen had always found unremarkable. She approached the bridge around 3 p.m. The weather was clear, visibility perfect. She could see the bridge from nearly a mile away, the steel and concrete structure standing out against the landscape. Everything looked normal. Helen downshifted as she approached, her loaded trailer making the truck sluggish on the slight incline leading to the bridge. As her front wheels rolled onto the bridge deck, Helen noticed the first change. The sound was wrong. Instead of the normal rumble of her tires on the expansion joints and the hollow echo that bridges produced, she heard something else. A deeper sound, resonant and musical, like a low note held on an organ. She glanced at her mirrors. The trailer was tracking properly, all wheels on the deck. The sound continued, growing slightly louder. Helen looked ahead through her windshield, and her breath caught. The bridge was longer than it should be. She'd crossed this bridge countless times. It was maybe 300 yards from end to end, a 30-second crossing. But now, looking ahead, she couldn't see the far end. The bridge stretched into the distance, much farther than 300 yards, the perspective making it seem to go on for miles. She checked her mirrors again. Behind her, the entrance to the bridge was visible, looking normal. But ahead, the structure continued, the steel support beams repeating in diminishing perspective, and there was no sign of the far shore. Helen's first thought was that she was having a medical emergency, a stroke or an aneurysm affecting her vision. She eased off the accelerator, slowing to 30 miles per hour, then 20. The bridge continued to stretch ahead. She brought her truck to a complete stop, right there in the middle of the bridge. The engine idled, the musical droning sound continuing underneath it. Helen sat frozen, her hands on the wheel, her mind trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe the bridge had been replaced, extended as part of a construction project she hadn't heard about. But no, that made no sense. She'd driven this route last week. There'd been no construction, no warnings, no detours. Helen reached for her phone. No signal. She tried her CB radio. Dead air, not even static. She looked at her GPS. The screen was flickering, unable to lock onto a position. Every technological solution failed her, leaving her alone with just her eyes and the evidence they were providing. The bridge had changed. She put her truck in gear and drove forward slowly. The bridge deck beneath her was solid. The support structures looked normal, but the length was impossible. She drove for 5 minutes at 20 miles per hour, covering nearly 2 miles, and she still couldn't see the end of the bridge. The shore she'd left behind was no longer visible in her mirrors, and the shore ahead remained out of sight. The musical droning grew louder, and Helen realized it was coming from the bridge itself. The structure was vibrating, not violently but consistently, producing that deep, resonant tone. And as she listened, she began to distinguish patterns in the sound, rhythms that might have been language, or might have been warning, or might have been something else entirely. Then the bridge began to change in other ways. The support beams started to look different. Where they had been painted steel, they were now something else, something that looked organic, almost like bone. The concrete deck developed patterns, lines, and swirls that hadn't been there before, designs that might have been decorative or might have been writing in a script Helen didn't recognize. She stopped again, terror overwhelming her. This wasn't a medical emergency. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. The bridge was transforming around her, becoming something that shouldn't exist, something that defied rational explanation. Helen considered backing up, turning around, but the trailer made that nearly impossible on the narrow bridge deck. And something told her that going backward wouldn't help, that the bridge behind her had probably changed just as much as the bridge ahead. Movement caught her eye. On the left side of the bridge, where there should have been a simple metal railing, there were now figures. They stood motionless, evenly spaced along the length of the bridge, humanoid in shape, but clearly not human. They were made of the same bone-like material as the support beams, and they faced inward, toward the roadway, toward her. Helen counted 10 of them visible in her field of view, and she knew there were more beyond her sight line. One of the figures moved. It raised an arm, long and jointed in too many places, and pointed ahead. The gesture was clear. Keep going. Helen didn't want to obey, but what choice did she have? She couldn't turn around, couldn't go back, couldn't call for help. The only direction available was forward. She drove, keeping her speed steady at 20 miles per hour, passing the figures. As she drew even with each one, it turned its head to follow her progress. The movement silent and smooth. Up close, she could see that they had faces of a sort, depressions and ridges that suggested eyes and mouths, without actually possessing them. They watched her pass, and Helen felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. The bridge continued for what felt like hours, though her clock showed only 30 minutes passing. The landscape on either side had disappeared entirely, replaced by a gray void, featureless and infinite. Helen was crossing something far larger than the Missouri River now. She was traversing a space between places, a gap in reality itself, and the bridge was the only solid thing in an existence that had become unmoored from normal physics. Then, ahead, she saw the end. It appeared suddenly, like a door opening, revealing the familiar landscape of rural Missouri. The bone-like support beams were transitioning back to painted steel. The organic patterns on the deck were fading, becoming plain concrete again. The figures along the sides were gone, or perhaps had become the simple metal railings they should have been all along. Helen's front wheels rolled off the bridge deck onto normal asphalt. The musical droning cut off instantly, leaving only the familiar sound of her diesel engine. She drove another 100 yards and then pulled over onto the shoulder, her whole body trembling. She looked back at the bridge. It was normal, 300 yards long, steel and concrete, looking exactly as it always had. Cars were crossing it in both directions, none of them experiencing anything unusual. Helen sat there for nearly an hour before she felt steady enough to continue driving. She completed her delivery to St. Louis, but she called her dispatcher that evening and quit. She gave a vague explanation about family health issues requiring her attention, and they accepted it without question. She didn't tell anyone what had happened on the bridge. Who would believe her? Helen got a job working in a warehouse, staying in one place, never traveling more than 10 miles from her apartment. She can't bring herself to cross bridges anymore, not even small ones. She takes longer routes that avoid them. And if she absolutely must cross a bridge, she waits until there's heavy traffic, surrounding herself with other vehicles, as if their presence can keep reality stable. She's researched the bridge on Route 47, looking for similar stories, finding only vague references to accidents and closure for maintenance. Nothing about the bridge transforming. Nothing about figures made of bone. Nothing about crossings that take hours instead of seconds. Helen knows she crossed into something that day, passed through a space where bridges connect more than just opposite shores. They connect different versions of reality, different layers of existence, and sometimes, for reasons unknown, those connections become visible. She was allowed to cross, allowed to return, but she knows she was lucky. Other drivers might not be. Other drivers might find themselves on a bridge that changes, that extends, that crosses into the grey void and never finds the other side. Helen was shown the truth about bridges, about the spaces they span, and that knowledge has left her unable to trust them ever again. She walks now whenever possible, keeping her feet on solid ground, avoiding the structures that arch over emptiness, because she knows that sometimes the emptiness looks back, and sometimes the bridge itself is alive, aware, and hungry for travelers who will cross its length into territories where the rules we depend on cease to apply. Story 8. The Convoy That Vanished. Robert Bobby Larson had been part of a tight-knit group of independent truckers for over a decade. They called themselves the Night Riders, 7 drivers who regularly ran the same routes and often traveled together when their schedules aligned. They looked out for each other, shared road information, and maintained constant communication via their CB radios. In September 2020, 6 of them were hauling loads from Portland to Salt Lake City, traveling in a loose convoy along Interstate 84. Bobby was driving the 4th truck in the formation. What happened that night shattered the group and left Bobby with questions that will never be answered. They'd departed Portland around 7 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive in Salt Lake City by early afternoon the next day. The group consisted of Frank Willis in the lead truck, followed by Susan Chen, Michael O'Brien, Bobby in the 4th position, and DeMarco in 5th, and bringing up the rear was Tommy Vega. They were all experienced drivers, all careful and professional, all friends who'd shared hundreds of miles together. They maintained a half-mile spacing between trucks, close enough to help if someone had trouble, far enough to be safe. The stretch of I-84 through eastern Oregon was one of Bobby's favorite routes. The highway wound through high desert country, past rock formations and wide-open spaces that made him feel free in a way city driving never could. The night was clear, a 3/4 moon providing enough light to see the landscape beyond his headlights. The CB radio chatter was constant, the familiar voices of his friends making jokes, sharing observations, passing the time. Around midnight, they were approaching the town of Ontario, on the Oregon-Idaho border. Frank, in the lead truck, called back on the CB. "Got some fog coming up ahead, folks. Patchy, not too thick. Keep your spacing." Bobby acknowledged along with the others. He could see the fog in the distance, wisps of white drifting across the highway. Nothing unusual for this area at night. Susan's voice came through the radio. "Frank, I'm right behind you. Fog's getting denser. Visibility dropping." "Copy that," Frank replied. "Slowing to 50. Everyone maintain position." Bobby watched his speedometer drop as he matched the convoy's reduced speed. The fog enveloped Susan's truck, and then Michael's. Bobby was about to enter it himself when Tommy's voice crackled through from the back. "This fog's weird, guys. It's got movement to it. Everybody seeing this?" "Seeing it," Ann confirmed, "like it's flowing in patterns." Bobby's truck entered the fog bank, and immediately he understood what Tommy meant. The fog wasn't just sitting on the road. It was moving with purpose, swirling around his truck in ways that seemed deliberate. He gripped the wheel tighter, focusing on his lane markers. "Everyone stay calm," he said into his CB. "Just keep your spacing and—" Static erupted from his radio, loud and sudden. Bobby flinched, reaching to adjust the volume. When the static cleared, Frank's voice came through, but it sounded wrong. "Bobby? Bobby, do You copy? I copy, Frank. What's up? Where is everyone? I can't see any of you. My mirrors are empty. Bobby checked his own mirrors. He should have been able to see Anne's headlights behind him and Michael's taillights ahead. Both were gone. The fog was too thick to see anything beyond about 20 feet. I don't have visuals either, Frank. Everyone's sound off. Susan, static. Michael, static. Anne, Tommy. Nothing but that empty, dead static. Bobby's heart rate spiked. Frank, I can't raise anyone else. You still there? Still here, Bobby. What the hell is going on? I don't know. Let's just maintain speed and bearing. The fog will clear. We'll find each other on the other side. Bobby drove for what felt like an eternity, the fog never thinning, never changing. He tried the CB radio repeatedly, getting only static or occasional fragments of Frank's voice, distorted and breaking up. His GPS showed him on I-84, heading east as expected, but something about the display looked wrong. The road ahead on the map seemed to shimmer and shift, the line representing the highway wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. Then Frank's voice came through clearly. Bobby, I'm pulling over. Something's not right. I'm going to stop and wait for this fog to clear. Frank, wait, Bobby started to say, but the transmission cut off. He called Frank's name repeatedly, getting no response. Bobby made a decision. He was going to pull over too, wait out the fog, make sure everyone was okay. He signaled and began easing toward the shoulder. As he slowed, the fog suddenly cleared. It didn't thin gradually. It simply ended, as if Bobby had driven through a wall. One moment he was surrounded by impenetrable white. The next, he was in clear air under moonlight. Bobby immediately looked for the other trucks in his convoy. The highway ahead was empty. The highway behind was empty. He was completely alone on I-84. Bobby pulled onto the shoulder and grabbed his CB radio. Frank, Susan, anyone, this is Bobby. Please respond. Nothing. He tried his cell phone, calling each of them in turn. Every call went straight to voicemail. He checked his GPS again. It showed him on I-84, about 10 miles east of Ontario. That didn't make sense. The convoy had been together when they entered the fog, and Bobby hadn't been in the fog for more than 10 minutes. He should have traveled less than 10 miles. But the distance didn't matter. What mattered was that his friends were gone. Bobby sat there for nearly an hour, watching every vehicle that passed, hoping to see one of the familiar trucks from his convoy. None appeared. Finally, not knowing what else to do, he continued towards Salt Lake City, driving slowly, constantly scanning for any sign of the others. He reached Salt Lake City the next morning and made his delivery, then immediately started calling around. Frank's dispatcher hadn't heard from him. Susan wasn't answering her phone. Michael, Anne, and Tommy were all out of contact. Bobby filed missing persons reports with the police in Oregon and Idaho. Search and rescue teams were dispatched to look for the missing trucks along I-84. Bobby retraced the route, driving the stretch where they disappeared, looking for any clue. He found nothing. The fog was gone. The highway was normal. There was no evidence that 6 trucks had vanished. Over the next week, 3 of the trucks were found. Susan's truck was discovered in a rest area in Idaho, perfectly parked, no sign of damage, the cargo intact. Susan herself was never found. Michael's truck was located on a side road, 15 miles south of I-84, abandoned, the keys still in the ignition. Michael was gone. Anne's truck appeared in a truck stop parking lot in Wyoming, 300 miles off route. Anne had vanished. Frank, Tommy, and their trucks were never found. No wreckage, no sightings, no trace. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. The authorities investigated extensively, suspecting foul play, but found no evidence of anything criminal. The official conclusion was that the drivers had abandoned their vehicles for unknown reasons, possibly due to some kind of shared psychological episode triggered by stress or fatigue. Bobby knows better. He was there. He drove through that fog. He felt the wrongness of it, the sense that reality itself had become unstable. The convoy entered something on that stretch of I-84, passed through a space where the normal rules broke down, and only Bobby emerged on the other side. The others went somewhere else, or perhaps they're still in that fog, driving endlessly through white nothingness, calling out on their CB radios to friends who can't hear them. Bobby doesn't drive anymore. He sold his truck and took a job working dispatch for a freight company, coordinating routes for other drivers, making sure they stay safe. He's never told anyone the full story of what happened that night, sticking to the vague official narrative about the convoy separating in fog. But he monitors the missing persons databases obsessively, hoping for any sign that his friends are alive somewhere. He hasn't found any. Late at night sometimes, Bobby's CB radio crackles to life, even though it's not plugged in, not even in a truck. He keeps it in his apartment, on a shelf, a memento of his driving days. And sometimes he hears voices through that unpowered radio. Frank's voice, asking where everyone is. Susan's voice, reporting foggy conditions. Tommy's voice, saying the fog is weird, has movement to it. The transmissions last only seconds before fading into static, but Bobby hears them, and he knows his friends are still out there somewhere, trapped in a fog that never clears, on a highway that never ends, calling for help that will never arrive. He carries that knowledge like a wound that won't heal, a reminder that the highways we trust can betray us, that the convoys we form for safety can be scattered like leaves in a wind that blows from directions we don't have names for. Bobby survived, but his friends didn't, and he'll never know why he was the one who emerged from that fog, while the others remained trapped within it, driving forever through a white emptiness that exists between 1 mile and the next, in the spaces where reality forgets to maintain its grip, and travelers disappear into legends that other drivers whisper about, but never quite believe, until it happens to them.